Monte Carlo, July 1891. A small, balding Englishman walks into the grandest casino in the world. His name is Charles Wells. He is 50 years old. He is completely bankrupt, and the 4,000 pounds in his pocket isn't even his. It's borrowed. Wells is not a gambler. He's a swindler, a failed inventor who sells fake machines to widows in London. Every device he has ever built has failed. And the craziest part? In the next 11 hours, this broke con man is going to break the biggest casino in Europe. Not once, not twice, 11 times in a row. But this isn't just a story about a lucky streak. It's about the unbreakable mathematics the casino was built on, the song that would make his name famous in 14 languages, and the secret method he carried all the way to his grave. For 130 years, no one has been able to fully explain how he did it, because Charles Wells never told a single soul. Not a reporter, not the casino, not the courts that would later put him in a cell. Not even, as far as anyone knows, the woman who stayed with him to the very end. This is how a failed inventor beat Monte Carlo 11 times in one night. To understand what happened inside that casino, you first have to understand the man walking through the door. Charles DeVille Wells was born in 1841 in Hertfordshire, England, and raised in Marseille, where his father worked as an English teacher. From early on, Wells called himself an inventor, and technically, that was almost true. He held exactly one real patent, registered in 1868, a device for regulating the speed of a ship's propeller. He sold it for 5,000 francs, and then he never invented anything that worked again. Not once, in more than 2 decades of trying. But he kept calling himself an engineer, because for the next 20 years, that is what he sold, not machines, the idea of machines. A musical skipping rope for children. A torpedo that would shoot underwater and catch fish. A railway that would run from a seaside town to the coast in record time. A device that controlled steam through music. Every one of them sounded just plausible enough to be exciting, and just complicated enough that nobody could easily check. None of them worked. None of them existed beyond paper, but the patents looked real, the drawings looked real, and Wells was very good at talking. His method was always the same. He would find an investor, a widow, a retired officer, a small businessman with some savings tucked away. He would show them the patent, the diagrams, the impressive numbers. He would promise them 20% returns. They would hand over the money to build the prototype, and then Wells would take that money and vanish. By 1891, he had defrauded so many people that he was working under fake names out of a small office in London. One investor alone, a man named Cat, had handed him almost 19,000 pounds. Wells spent every penny of it, on nothing. So how does a 50-year-old con man, finally cornered, turn into the most famous gambler in the world overnight? By 1891, the walls were closing in. The fake addresses had stopped working. The angry investors were circling. Wells was about to be arrested, and he had exactly one move left. A few weeks earlier, another investor, a man whose name we still don't know, had given Wells 4,000 pounds for a fuel-saving device. It would turn out to be the last money Wells ever raised. And here is the part that tells you everything about what kind of man he was. He didn't build the device. He didn't even pretend to anymore. Instead, he took that borrowed 4,000 pounds, the last lifeline he had, and he bought a single train ticket to the south of France. A bankrupt swindler, gambling his final stake on a casino that had never been beaten. To understand why what he did next should have been impossible, you have to understand the building he walked into. The Casino de Monte Carlo, in 1891, was the largest casino on Earth. It was owned by the Blanc family. Francois Blanc had built it from nothing back in the 1860s, taking a swamp on the Riviera and transforming it into the gambling capital of Europe. By 1891, his son, Camille Blanc, was running the entire operation. And the numbers were staggering. The casino employed 2,000 croupiers and staff. That is more people than the entire Principality of Monaco had citizens. Every roulette table held 100,000 francs in chips, and behind the cashier sat a vault, holding gold and notes worth several million francs at any given moment. a reserve specifically designed so the house could pay any winner, no matter how large. It was, by any reasonable measure, the most secure money machine in continental Europe. 1,000 croupiers, 200 private detectives, a guaranteed reserve at every table, and a backup vault beneath the building. In all its years, it had never once been broken in a single session. Not once. Because the Blancs understood something most casino owners didn't. The house edge on European roulette is 2.7%. On any single spin, that edge means almost nothing. A player can win all night, but over 1,000 spins, that tiny edge stops being chance and becomes mathematics. Inevitable, grinding, unbreakable. Time itself was on the casino's side. So the Blanc family actually let people win in the short term. They welcomed it. They encouraged the newspapers to write about it. There was even a ceremony. When a single player won so much that he drained the entire reserve at a table, when he broke the bank, the croupiers would stop play. They would lay a black crepe cloth across the table, like a coffin over a grave. The orchestra would pause, and the winner would be celebrated like a hero. It was pure theater, and it was brilliant marketing, because by the very next morning, the table would be quietly restocked, the math would resume its patient work, and every gambler in Europe would have read about the lucky man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo. And almost all of them would come, and almost all of them would lose. But here's the thing. The casino had been broken before, just once, and the Blancs had learned a hard, expensive lesson from it. A lesson that should have made what Wells did completely impossible. Back in 1873, an English mill engineer named Joseph Jagger had done it. He hadn't trusted luck for a second. He had hired 6 clerks to record every single spin, on every single wheel, for weeks on end. And buried in all that data, he found one wheel that was very slightly off balance, quietly favoring 9 specific numbers. He bet on those numbers, and he won 300,000 francs in just 3 days. The Blancs studied exactly what Jagger had done, and they responded. They began rotating the wheels between tables every single night, so no player could track one wheel for long. They recalibrated the bearings. They switched the numbered pockets around. They hired inspectors whose only job was to test the wheels for bias. So by 1891, the management of the Casino de Monte Carlo were absolutely, completely confident. Their wheels were perfectly random. Their reserves were unbreakable. Their math was undefeated. And then a small, bald Englishman with no money walked through the door. Late July, 1891. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, Wells walked into the Saal Schmidt, one of the smaller, more elegant gaming rooms. Gas chandeliers overhead, velvet curtains, the smell of cigars hanging in the warm air. He sat down at a roulette table and bought in for £4,000, about 100,000 francs. The croupiers didn't recognize him. Why would they? He was just another small Englishman in a cheap suit. There were dozens like him in any given week. Hopeful men with a little money and a system that would surely fail by dawn. He began betting even money bets, red, black, even, odd. Small stakes at first. He won, he lost. He won, he lost. A completely normal pattern. 20 minutes went by, and nothing about him stood out at all. And then something began happening at his table that nobody at the Casino de Monte Carlo had ever seen. Wells started winning. Not occasionally, continuously. He won on red, he won on black. He won on even, he won on the columns. It was as if the wheel had quietly decided to work for him. And at one stretch, the part that historians still cannot fully explain to this day, he won 23 out of 30 consecutive spins. How likely is that on a fair wheel? About 1 in 10 million. The kind of odds that, if you saw them once in a lifetime, you would call a miracle. Wells was producing them at a single table, hour after hour, in front of professional croupiers who had watched thousands of players come and go. By midnight, Wells had won the entire reserve at his table, 100,000 francs. A croupier hurried over to the floor manager and whispered something urgent. The floor manager walked quickly to the cashier. The cashier opened a safe behind the counter and withdrew the secondary reserve. The chips were wheeled back to Wells's table on a trolley, and play resumed, as if order had been restored. Within an hour, he broke it again. Now, the casino's process for a broken bank was supposed to happen maybe once a month. twice at the most. The cashiers had simply never run it back to back, let alone over and over in a single night. By the third break, they had to send a messenger down to the underground vault for more cash. By the fifth break, 2 staff members were using a handcart to physically wheel sacks of gold and franc notes up the marble staircase to the gaming floor. The most powerful casino in the world had been reduced to hauling its reserves upstairs by hand, just to keep one Englishman in chips. And through all of it, Wells didn't move. He didn't take a break. He didn't eat. He didn't drink anything stronger than water. He just kept betting, mostly on the same colors, sometimes switching, doubling on certain numbers, then walking the bets back. And here is the strangest part of all. There was no obvious system. Nothing any croupier, watching closely for hours, could write down and follow. By 3 in the morning, the table was completely surrounded. Word had spread through the entire casino like fire. Players from other rooms drifted over to watch the impossible. The orchestra in the main hall stopped playing, because half the audience had simply left their seats to come and see the Englishman. And finally, Camille Blanc himself was sent for. The owner of the largest casino in the world arrived in evening dress, stood quietly behind the table, and watched a stranger dismantle his unbreakable machine, spin after spin, and could do absolutely nothing about it. By 6 o'clock in the morning, Charles Wells had broken the bank 11 times. In 11 hours, he had won 1 million francs. In today's money, somewhere between $4 and $6 million. It was the largest single-session win in the entire history of the casino, a record that had stood for decades, shattered in a single night by a bankrupt con man in a cheap suit. The croupier slowly drew the black crepe cloth across the table, the 11th time that night, the 11th little funeral, and then Wells simply stood up, picked up his cane, walked straight past Camille Blanc without making eye contact, and left. By the time the next train pulled out of Monte Carlo, every newspaper in Europe had a reporter on it. Within 48 hours, the story was on the front page of every British, French, and German daily. The Times, Le Figaro, the Berliner Tageblatt. The man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo. But the casino now had a problem, far bigger than 1 million francs. Because if Wells had truly figured out a system that worked, and the casino could not explain how, then it threatened the entire mathematical foundation the whole business was built on. The promise of Monte Carlo was simple. The house always wins, eventually, because the math guarantees it. Wells had just made that promise look like a lie, in front of the whole world. So, Camille Blanc did what any rational casino owner would do. He hired investigators. Within a week, 2 private detectives were following Wells everywhere. Where he ate, where he slept, who he met with. They were hunting for the trick, the partner, the hidden machine that had to be there somewhere. And they found nothing. No co-conspirators, no secret signals, no hidden devices, no suspicious meetings at all. Just a quiet, unremarkable Englishman going about his day. Reporters were sent to the casino floor. They watched Wells's old seat. They watched the wheels turn for hours. They interviewed the croupiers, and they wrote, in dispatch after dispatch, that they could detect no obvious pattern in his bets whatsoever. So they asked the man himself. Wells sat down for an interview with a London paper. "How did you do it?" they asked. He told them he had developed an infallible system, but he refused to describe it. He said only that it was based on mathematics, and luck, and patience. He said that anyone could do it, given enough time. The casino didn't believe him. Neither did the reporters. Neither did the gamblers reading the papers. But there was nothing anyone could prove. So Camille Blanc made a decision that, looking back, seems completely insane. He let Wells come back. In November of 1891, 4 months after that first night, Wells returned to Monte Carlo. He sat at the same table. He bought in for a similar amount, and, against all odds and all mathematics, he did it again. He broke the bank. By the most reliable count, 6 more times. Some sources say 8, some say 10. And once again, he walked away with another fortune, while the croupiers laid down their black crepe cloth over and over. If the first night could be dismissed as a once-in-10 million miracle, the second visit made that explanation almost impossible. Lightning does not strike the same man, at the same table, twice. Something else was going on. and the casino knew it. So why on earth would a casino allow this? Because the Blancs had calculated something the public hadn't. Every newspaper article about Wells brought an estimated 10,000 new gamblers to Monte Carlo. Every single broken bank headline was free advertising, worth far more than the £1,000,000 Wells had walked away with. So the Blanc family didn't chase him out. They did the exact opposite. They put his picture in their own promotional materials. They mentioned him warmly in interviews. Charles Wells, the man robbing them blind, was somehow the single best piece of marketing they had ever had. But Camille Blanc was still watching, still waiting, because beneath all the showmanship, he was certain, absolutely certain, that Wells had a method. And he was right. The detectives never found it. The reporters never found it. The croupiers never found it. But the answer had been sitting in plain sight all along. Because Wells was an engineer, and the casino had already been broken once before, 18 years earlier, by another English engineer, Joseph Jagger. The wheels. Wells had almost certainly done exactly what Jagger had done. He had watched, he had recorded, for days, maybe for weeks, before that very first session. An inconspicuous bald Englishman had probably been sitting quietly in those rooms with a notebook, watching the wheels, tracking which numbers came up just a little too often, hunting for the same kind of flaw Jagger had found back in 1873. And the flaws were real, physical things. A wheel with a slightly worn bearing, a pocket cut a fraction of a millimeter too deep, a floor that had settled, ever so slightly, at half a degree off level. Tiny imperfections that no gambler would ever notice, but that a patient engineer, armed with enough data, could read like a map. Wells wasn't beating chance, he was beating a machine. And machines, he knew, are never perfect. And how do we know this is even possible? Because exactly 100 years later, in Madrid, a man named Gonzalo Garcia Pelayo would do the very same thing. He sat with a notebook and tracked 30,000 spins. He found the biased wheels, and he broke the bank at a Madrid casino for over €1,000,000. But unlike Wells, Garcia Pelayo explained his method openly. He even wrote a book about it. He went on Spanish television and said, simply, roulette wheels are man-made, and man-made things have flaws. Wells never said any of that. In January of 1892, he returned to Monte Carlo a third time, and this time, the magic was gone. He lost 100,000 francs, and he never went back. Whatever flaw he had found in those wheels, the casino, with its nightly rotations and recalibrations, had very likely fixed it. The window had closed. But while Wells was preparing for that third trip, something else was happening, far away in London. A music hall composer had been reading the newspapers about Wells for 6 months. The story was everywhere. The bald Englishman who broke the casino 11 times in a single night. So he sat down at a piano and wrote a song. As I walk along the Bois de Boulogne with an independent air, you can hear the girls declare, he must be a millionaire, the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo. He took it to a music hall singer, who bought the whole thing outright for just £10. And then that singer performed it. In London, in Paris, in Berlin, in New York, in Vienna, in St. Petersburg, in Sydney. He sang it in 14 different languages, over 250,000 times across his entire life. By the spring of 1892, every street performer in Europe was playing it on accordions and pianos. It was sung in pubs from Glasgow to Naples. American newspapers complained that the tune had become completely unavoidable in any major city. It became the single most popular song of the decade. The BBC still keeps an original recording in its archives. From 1903, the song is still in print today. It is turned up in films like Lawrence of Arabia and Alien Covenant. For 130 years, that chorus has never once stopped circulating somewhere in the world. And Charles Wells, alive in 1892, watching this song explode across an entire continent, was furious, because the songwriter hadn't paid him a single penny. The whole world was singing his name, and he wasn't seeing a franc of it. Think about how strange his situation had become. He was now the most famous gambler in the world. The Blanc family was using his face in their marketing. Music halls were singing about him every single night. Reporters were chasing him through the streets of Paris. And yet, underneath all of it, He hadn't actually won at Monte Carlo in 6 months. The money from those first 2 glorious sessions was running out. The third trip had cost him dearly, and his old life, the fake patents, the defrauded widows, the angry investors with long memories, was finally, quietly, catching up. So Wells made a calculation that would destroy him. He decided to use the fame. He decided to become an investment opportunity himself. He had a yacht built, a big one. He renamed it the Palais Royal. He sailed it grandly around the French and English coasts. The famous man who broke the bank, living exactly the life people imagined he must lead. And he began telling investors that he was about to launch the largest steam shipping company in Europe, backed, of course, by his enormous Monte Carlo fortune. It was the perfect con, because for once, the legend did half the work for him. The investors gave him money, a great deal of it, and Wells did exactly what Wells had always done. His entire life, with every penny anyone ever trusted him with, he spent it. In late 1892, 2 French detectives boarded the Palais Royal in the harbor at Le Havre. They had been tracking him for months. The investors he had defrauded since coming back from Monte Carlo now numbered in the dozens, and the amounts were significant. They arrested him on the deck of his own yacht. Wells was extradited to England and tried at the Old Bailey in March 1893. The jury convicted him on 23 separate counts of fraud. He was sentenced to 8 years in Portland prison. He served 6 of them and came out in 1899, older, quieter, and, as always, completely broke. Here was a man who had, just a few years earlier, held £1 million in his hands, who had been sung about in 14 languages, who had been the most famous gambler alive, and he walked out of prison with nothing, into a century that was about to turn. He moved to Paris and tried to start over, and for a while, it actually worked. But in 1910, using the false name Lucien Rivière, he opened a small private bank in Paris. He promised his depositors 365% annual interest, 1%, every single day, a number so absurd it should have frightened anyone who heard it. But it was the exact same fraud he had run his entire life. A patent for a machine that didn't exist, just dressed in different clothes. The machine this time was simply the bank itself. And this time, his fame worked for him. He was the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo. Surely a man like that knew how to make money. 6,000 people poured their savings into his bank, 2 million francs. And when the French police finally arrested him in January 1912, the money was already gone. 5 more years in prison. He came out in 1917, aged 76. The First World War was ending, and Europe had become a different place entirely. Wells lived for 5 more years, in a single rented room in Paris, with his much younger companion, who had stayed faithfully beside him through every prison sentence. He died in 1922, owing 2 weeks of rent. He was buried in a pauper's grave, and when his body was prepared for burial, the man at the morgue searched his pockets and found nothing at all, not a single franc. The most famous gambler in the world had died with empty pockets. 100 years later, in Madrid, Gonzalo Garcia Pelayo was sitting in a casino with a notebook. He had read about Charles Wells, and like almost everyone else, he had assumed it must have been luck, a statistical fluke, the most extraordinary streak in the history of gambling, but ultimately just random chance. Garcia Pelayo proved otherwise. He sat in casinos for months. He recorded 30,000 spins, one by one, the same patient grind Jagger had done in 1873, and Wells had almost certainly done in 1891. He found the wheels that were 1 millimeter off true, and he bet only on the bias numbers, and he won over €1 million. Then he did something neither Jagger nor Wells ever did. He explained exactly how, openly, on live television, with the math laid out for everyone to see. He even wrote a book about it. And whenever he was asked about Charles Wells, Garcia Pelayo always gave the same answer. Wells was an engineer, he said, and engineers don't believe in luck. The Blanc family had always quietly suspected the very same thing, but they never said it out loud. Admitting it would have ruined the legend, and the legend was selling Monte Carlo more tickets than the casino ever could on its own. So for 130 years, the question has stayed open. Did Charles Wells beat the Casino de Monte Carlo with cold, patient mathematics? or with the single most extraordinary run of luck in all of human history? The casino's official answer was always the same. It was luck. Wells's official answer, right up until the day he died alone in that rented Paris room, was that it was a system. He never described it. He never wrote it down. He never sold it, never taught it, never breathed a word of it to a single person. He took it with him into a pauper's grave. And that is the strange, perfect irony at the heart of his whole life. The man who failed at every machine he ever invented. The man who defrauded thousands of trusting people with patents that never worked, with prototypes that never existed, with fortunes that were always about to arrive. That same man may have, just once, invented exactly one thing that actually did work. A method for breaking the largest casino in Europe 11 times in 11 hours. And the only thing he ever made that truly worked, he never sold to a single soul. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.